even attempted, much less taken against me. The administrative leave was a negotiated mechanism by which my resignation would take effect on a certain date. It was not a punishment, it was not a disciplinary action, it was simply a way for me to resign.
Dr. Arden, you'd agree it's not the normal course of business to be put on administrative leave if everything's going, I guess, hunky-dory, right?
Things weren't going hunky-dory. I was resigning under pressure.
For gross misconduct and poor operations.
Well, again, I deny that it was gross misconduct. There were issues with the operations. I had not fixed 20 years of chaos in an agency in 5 years.
Your Honor, I believe that's the state's proffer.
Do you want to present any testimony to clarify the proffer, Mr. Taylor?
Yes, please. Now, Dr. Arden, the allegations of gross misconduct, did it have anything to do with your ability to practice medicine?
Nothing whatsoever with the practice of medicine or my ability to do so.
Okay, nothing further.
I sustain the objection of that cross-examination. Any other legal issues?
None from the defense.
All right, we're ready for adjourn. Stand when the jury comes.
Judge, for the record, could the court of order make sure that when she's referring to Mr. Taylor, it's the second Mr. Taylor?
How do you propose she do that?
He's the third, so.
How do you propose she do that?
It would be Clyde Taylor the third who's doing the examination as opposed to Clyde Taylor.
Could everybody be seated, please? Good morning, folks. Thanks for being back here this morning. Hope everybody got in dry. You may call your next witness. We have already placed the witness under oath. You are under oath, sir.
Yes,
you
Your
may
Honor.
proceed, Mr. Taylor.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury, please?
I'm Dr. Jonathan Arden. It's A-R-D-E-N.
And Dr. Arden, what do you do for a living?
I'm a physician, and in particular, I am a forensic pathologist.
And I imagine you had to complete some sort of education to achieve this title.
Yes, sir.
Could you summarize your educational experience with me?
After I graduated from college, I attended and graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School, receiving my MD, or Doctor of Medicine degree, in 1980. I then served in 2 medical specialty training programs, what people frequently call residencies. The first was a 3-year program in anatomic pathology, which took place at the New York University Medical Center in New York City. I then followed that with a 1-year program in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland. That's located in Baltimore.
And upon completion of your education, summarize for the jury what your professional experience or work experience has been.
After I completed the education and training I just outlined for you, I then became board certified in both anatomic and forensic pathology by the American Board of Pathology in 1985. I then embarked on a career as a government employed medical examiner. I spent a total of 20 years of government service. I worked in 4 different offices, including 9 years with the Office of Chief Medical Examiner for the City of New York, where I finished as the second in command, the first Deputy Chief Medical Examiner. I then spent 5.5 years as the Chief Medical Examiner in Washington, D.C. At the end of that 20-year total time of government service, I then opened a private consulting practice in forensic pathology and medicine, the type of work that brings me here today. I've been doing that for, I guess, the past roughly 13 years, close to 13 years. In addition to my private consulting work, I spent, simultaneously, I spent about 18 months with an appointment in the medical examiner system in Northern Virginia, which is where I live. That was a community-based position. The title medical examiner really are physicians who are out in the field, kind of being the front line for the system. And then for the past about 8.5 years, I have a part-time position with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of West Virginia, And in that capacity, I actually do perform the usual functions of a medical examiner, doing autopsies, issuing death certificates and autopsy reports, being available to testify in court. But again, that's only a part-time position.
Now, throughout the course of your work history, had you had the opportunity to perform actual autopsy?
Yes, I've personally performed about 3,000 forensic autopsies in my career, and I've examined hundreds of decedents to issue death certificates without the complete autopsy.
And you mentioned that you were board certified. What does that mean that you're board certified?
Each of the medical specialties in this country has a governing board. So for me, that's the American Board of Pathology. Each of these boards puts together standards for education and training, and if you can show that you have graduated from medical school, have a valid medical license, you've fulfilled all of their training requirements, and you pay them a fee, you can then sit for their examinations in each of the various fields. If you pass the examinations, then you have demonstrated the requisite training and knowledge base, and so they certify that you have met this level of accomplishment or achievement. So it's a demonstration by an independent board that you have had the proper education and training and that you're capable of practicing.
And you mentioned you had 2 separate certifications?
Yes, sir.
And one of them was anatomical pathology?
Yes, sir.
And one of them is forensic pathology?
That's correct.
Just briefly summarize what's the difference between the 2.
Well, to go backwards a step, pathology is the medical specialty that studies the changes in the form or sometimes the function of the human body. And by changes, I'm talking about the effects of diseases or injuries. My primary original area of study in general pathology was anatomic pathology, which studies the changes of the anatomy. That's the structures of your body. So pathology is a diagnostic medical specialty that looks at the tissues and organs of the body, some of which you can do with the naked eye, things you can hold in your hand, and also involves looking at things under the microscope, and then you interpret those findings to determine if there are diseases or injuries present in that part of the body or in the body. Forensic pathology then takes the broad general background of general medicine and anatomic pathology and applies it primarily to the process that I refer to as investigation and certification of certain types of deaths. The kinds of deaths that are particularly examined and are within the field of forensic pathology are first and foremost what we call violent deaths. And a violent death simply means any death where any kind of injury causes the death or plays a role in causing the death. Forensic pathology is also devoted to deaths that are sudden and unexpected. So typically people who die without a medical diagnosis, outside of a hospital, for instance. And so that's the general practice of forensic pathology. And just to wrap it up, the term that I use to encapsulate the process is investigate and certify. So when a medical examiner or a forensic pathologist is involved in basically trying to figure out how and why somebody dies, it begins with an investigation into the background and the circumstances. It continues with the medical examination of the body and maybe laboratory tests, and then you pull all those things together, you issue an opinion on the cause of death, the manner of death, and you put that on the death certificate, which is the certification part.
So do you have to have a license to practice medicine?
Yes, sir.
And do you hold such licenses?
I do.
And how many?
I currently have 5 licenses to practice medicine. I'm licensed in Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and New York.
Have you ever testified in court in an expert capacity?
Yes, sir.
How many times?
Somewhat over 900 times that neighborhood.
And have you also been so certified in Leon County, state of Florida?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this time I tender Dr. Arden as an expert in the field of forensic pathology and anatomical pathology.
Any board desire on his qualifications?
No, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Now, Dr. Arden, you mentioned that you have a consulting practice.
Yes, sir.
And have you been retained by the defense to provide your services in this case?
I have.
So what actually have you done to be prepared to come to court and testify today?
I was provided various materials that I reviewed. That includes primarily the file documents from the medical examiner's office here, principally the autopsy report and the toxicology report from Ms. Frasch. I was also provided and reviewed the autopsy photographs. I was provided a set of the microscopic slides so I could examine those myself to see what they did or didn't reveal. I was also provided some emergency medical records, both the emergency medical service and the emergency department or emergency room records for Ms. Frasch. And as background in the investigation, I was provided with some grand jury testimony.
Now, having become familiar and also reviewed Dr. Flanagan's report and also heard her testimony.
Yes, I reviewed her autopsy report, and I had the opportunity to see her testify from the live stream here.
Okay. Now, the fact that Dr. Flanagan actually had the opportunity to personally perform the autopsy herself, does that put you at a disadvantage in rendering her opinion?
The best answer is not really. Of course, you cannot substitute for being there and actually examining the body personally and doing the work. But in terms of the ability to render opinions and make conclusions, the important factor is that it's the duty of the medical examiner to document the pertinent findings in ways that an independent source can review them and arrive at independent conclusions. So in this instance, I have her reports, I have the photographs to document the findings such that I can see them with my own eyes. I had the microscopic slides which permitted me to see the features microscopically, again, with my own eyes. I had some of the same background material, such as the medical records that would have been available to her. So it's a required function of being a medical examiner that you properly document the necessary findings, because there are other reasons for people to review them, not just an outside consultant like me coming in, which is one thing you need to be prepared for, but within the office you have supervisory review. Your boss has to look over the work and see if it's okay. You have to do some version of quality assurance, which requires review by a person who wasn't at the autopsy. Sometimes the medical examiner leaves or retires or dies. Somebody has to be able to testify on the case. So I don't think it's put me at a disadvantage. I think I have sufficient evidence to base my opinions on.
So let's turn to some of Dr. Flanagan's conclusions, and I'll ask you if you agree or disagree, and then you can certainly provide any explanation you feel appropriate. What she has described primarily is two injuries, or two major areas of injury to the head, one to the right, one to the left. Would you agree with that?
I do.
So starting first with the injury to the right side of the head, would you agree with her conclusions in terms of how that injury was caused, or in her description or summation of the injury?
Well, the injury to the right side of the head, I assume we're talking about the external injuries, the facial bruises.
Correct.
I largely agree with her. I mean, the basic concept of how you get bruising is that these are blunt impact injuries, and I'm sure that she expressed that opinion, and I concur with that. In terms of when they occurred or the totality of the circumstances, we may have some slight disagreement, but the idea that those are blunt impact injuries, I agree with her.
She was really unable to determine what object it was or what the blunt object was. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I agree with that.
In other words, there's no real way to tell.
Correct.
What about the possibility of a fist causing those injuries? Would you agree with that?
I agree it's possible. There is no feature of the surface bruising on the right side of her face that allows me to say specifically a fist is the most likely or has a pattern that matches it, but a fist is certainly consistent among many other potential explanations.
I believe she also opined that a golf club would not have caused that injury. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that as well.
Turning to the injury to the left side where there was more extensive damage, would you agree with her summation?
Yes, actually, in terms of how the injuries to the left side of the head were caused, I do agree with her.
So in other words, there was some sort of very broad surface object, perhaps the ground.
Yes, actually the nature of the surface injuries, and I also relate it to the internal injuries, but the nature of the surface injuries to the left side of her head, the temple region, was spread over some area. It had abrasion, scraping, which is particularly consistent with a hard or a rough surface that that part of the area of the body rubs against or scrapes against. There was bleeding underneath, so this is indeed a blunt impact against a relatively broader surface with some firmness or roughness to its texture. So it is, and also when I correlate the internal injuries, that left-sided injury is indeed consistent with falling down and striking a surface like the ground.
Now, in terms of the overall severity of those head injuries, I believe Dr. Flanagan testified that although it wouldn't be immediately fatal, they could potentially be fatal if left untreated. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I only agree in the sense of if she expressed it as could be, which really is at the level of it's possible. Possible is a very broad range. Is there some possibility, however small, that those head injuries would have caused her death if she had otherwise survived and gone untreated? Yes, it's possible. I prefer to say it's highly unlikely. She did have some significant internal head injuries, and she did have some brain injuries, but the brain injuries actually were surface contusions, mostly on the right side, which again is part of the pattern that corroborates the interpretation of her falling down and hitting her head as opposed to being struck on the left side. But those kinds of injuries are typically not fatal. So is it possible? Yes. Is it likely, or would I expect that to be the outcome? No.
What about, she briefly mentioned maybe some damage around the throat area. Are you familiar with her opinion there?
Yes, sir.
And do you agree, or did you reach a different conclusion?
I believe that I agree with Dr. Flanagan. I'm not sure if she expressed a discrete opinion on that, but there were two small areas of bleeding in some of the layers of muscles on the front of the neck or in the front of the throat. Bleeding, hemorrhage in those muscles is something that raises a concern for some form of neck compression. I think she expressed this opinion. I don't want to misrepresent what she said, but certainly it is my opinion that these do not represent strangulation. I think that was the important part about interpreting those areas of hemorrhage that she found in the throat muscles. Given the totality of the evidence and the absence of other evidence, in my opinion, they do not represent strangulation.
Why is that? Is there anything else that you would have expected to see if it were, that would have been more consistent with strangulation?
Yes, actually, if I were going to opine specifically that these did represent injuries that constituted strangulation, I would expect a great likelihood that she would have pinpoint hemorrhages on her eyes or on her face, what we call petechiae or petechial hemorrhages. I think it's likely she would have had more internal damage. She might have had some fracturing of the structures of the voice box. So in the absence of any of those other factors, and given, again, all the facts that I do know as far as explaining her death, in my opinion, those are not representative of strangulation. They're more likely to have resulted from the manipulation in the attempts to resuscitate her, including putting the breathing tube down her throat.
So did you ultimately come to a conclusion as to Mrs. Frasch's cause of death?
Yes, sir.
And what would that be?
In my opinion, the cause of death of Ms. Frasch was drowning.
And how did you reach that conclusion?
That's based on a combination of both positive and negative evidence. The positive evidence to support a conclusion of drowning is circumstantial to begin with. You have a person who's recovered from a body of water, somebody who has been submerged. You have physical findings that are supportive of the conclusion of drowning. There is no anatomical finding that proves drowning by itself. So, for instance, in this case, we have the buildup of fluid in her lungs. I think Dr. Flanagan demonstrated that to the jury and recorded that in both her autopsy report and the autopsy photographs. So you get what's called pulmonary edema. It's the fluid buildup and the foam and the froth that she demonstrated in the airways. That's very common with drowning. Excuse me. I said both positive and negative evidence. The negative evidence is that when you conclude that somebody died of drowning, you have to exclude other alternative causes of death reasonably. So to take a, pardon me if it's a silly example, if you recover a deceased person from a body of water who has a gunshot wound to the head, the gunshot wound is clearly going to be more important, and being in the water didn't factor into it. So here we have a person who does not have another fatal injury. She does have the head injuries that we just discussed. Those are unlikely to have caused her death, especially in the short term. So given the absence of a superseding cause of death, given the circumstances, given the corroborative findings of the pulmonary edema, this adds up to a total picture of a person who's died from drowning.
And there's been some discussion and talk about rigor mortis, which I guess in layman terms is essentially when the body stiffens after death.
Yes, sir.
By the time that Dr. Flanagan would have conducted the autopsy, is it typical that you would have full rigor set in, that is the body's for the most part stiff?
Under most circumstances, yes. I mean, again, we typically recover bodies relatively shortly after they died, and then given the time it takes to transport and get to the medical examiner and then do the examination that day, the next day, yes, most of the time the person has then had enough time to develop full or well-developed rigor mortis.
Well, so turning now to the time of death, do you have would you agree that it's difficult to pinpoint a time of death, as Dr. Flanagan testified?
Oh, yes. Pinpointing the time of death is almost never possible.
And so then you look to certain factors like rigor mortis to make your best opinion. Is that accurate?
Yes, you try to get an estimate of a reasonable range, but pinpointing, that's only Hollywood.
Okay. So aside from considering the lack of rigor mortis, at the time that was reported by the EMTs and paramedics, conducting the actual autopsy wouldn't necessarily give you any advantage in determining the onset of rigor. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Given that time frame between death and recovery of the body and then the autopsy, the observations at the time of the autopsy are usually of little value, sometimes no value, but usually of very limited value in terms of trying to estimate time of death. The observations that are made of the body at the time of recovery are much more valid and useful for that purpose.
What about livor mortis? There is some discussion about livor mortis, or the lack thereof, or its appearance at the time of the autopsy. Did that have any influence on your determination as to the time of death?
Yes, it did.
How so?
Well, livor mortis, also sometimes called lividity, is the settling of the blood due to gravity after death. Your heart stops beating, your blood stops circulating, gravity takes over. Whichever side is down, the blood starts to settle in that direction. Wherever the blood settles, you get pink or red or purple discoloration, and that's what the livor mortis is. And the time frame of formation of livor and it becoming prominent, and then eventually it stays wherever it is, it becomes fixed, as they say, that's very variable. So it's not an extremely useful feature as far as trying to estimate time of death. The one feature about livor that may be helpful, and in my opinion is relevant to this matter, is that the onset of livor mortis is something that happens in the very early postmortem period. So And the textbooks don't agree exactly. I mean, some textbooks will give you time frame for onset of livor mortis starting at 0, meaning the moment of death. That's very fast. Many of them will say 30 minutes or so, but the onset of livor mortis is definitely something that happens in the very early postmortem period. So if you're dealing with a case where it hasn't come on, it hasn't become visible, or it's just starting to become visible, I think that's a valid factor as far as trying to make that estimate of the range and putting you into that very early postmortem period.
Were there any other factors that you considered in reaching a determination as to the time of death?
Yes, sir.
And what would they have been?
The other two factors that I considered, number one was body temperature, and the other was the presence or absence of the postmortem wrinkling of the fingers and toes.
Okay, can you explain how body temperature would have impacted your conclusion?
When a person dies, of course, the metabolism and the control systems all stop. So you no longer maintain your internal body temperature the way we warm-blooded animals do under normal circumstances. So basically what happens is that bodies that are in the environment start to cool relative to original body temperature in the postmortem period. And because most people, when they're dead, are in environments, ambient temperatures that are lower than the roughly 98.6 that's your body temperature. So under most circumstances, unless you're in the desert or something like that, the body then passively begins to cool. So you can use the cooling of the body as another mechanism of estimating how long a person has been dead. That process or that factor is complicated in this instance because she is practically unclothed and she's in a cold body of water. So that will accelerate the time course of the cooling of her body. I am not aware of any published literature or data that permits me to try to estimate how rapidly she would cool in that water. Exposure to water, or I should say immersion in water, since the water is in contact with your whole body surface, will speed up the transfer of heat from the body to the water. And the cold water itself, of course, is much colder than usual air temperature, so that speeds up the process. I cannot provide you with any kind of numerical guidance of how rapidly she would cool. Simply, at this point, all I'm left with is she clearly had cooled substantially in the time she was in the water. It's consistent with being in cold water. I don't, in this case, have any more precise way of relating the temperature to the time, so it really just becomes a factor that's highly consistent with being in the cold water, and I cannot be any more precise with that.
Was there an actual body temperature of Mrs. Frasch at the time she was recovered?
No, there was no body temperature measured when she was recovered. There was the attempt to take her temperature in the emergency department, and it didn't register. My understanding is that the thermometer used would register down to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, so she was likely at or below 80, but I cannot be any more precise in relating that to an estimation of her time of death.
And what was the last factor that you...
It was the wrinkling of the fingers and toes.
And how is that significant?
That again is significant in the sense that this is a very common occurrence if you have a body in water. And this pertains pretty much equally to a live person or a dead person. So the wrinkling of the fingertips, the forensic literature refers to it with a kind of poetic name of washerwoman wrinkling. I think most of us just use the term you use with your kids in the bathtub. It's like pruning. That's a process that is known to occur in bodies, and it occurs in the relatively early time period of immersion as well. Excuse me. And so it is not something that can be used to estimate very precisely when a person died. But again, it's similar to what I mentioned about livor mortis. Livor mortis begins in the early postmortem period. Well, the wrinkling of the fingers is something that occurs relatively early after immersion, and it can easily be seen in 20 or 30 minutes. It is very commonly seen in a body that's been immersed for an hour or more. And so, again, the absence of any such wrinkling of the fingers or toes speaks to the likelihood that she has been immersed for a relatively short period of time.
So taking all that together, how long do you, in your opinion, do you think Mrs. Frasch was dead before she was discovered?
In my opinion, she was dead for a relatively short time before she was discovered and removed from the water. And when she was removed, the evidence indicates that she did not have any rigor mortis. The evidence indicates that she had no livor mortis recognized at the death scene, and the very earliest development of livor mortis recognized at the emergency department. Her body temperature was down. She had no wrinkling of the fingers or toes. To me, this puts us into the very early postmortem period, most probably within an hour or two of her death when she was discovered. There's some wiggle room around that, but certainly very likely within an hour or two.
Is it possible that she could have been deceased in as little as 30 minutes before she was discovered?
Yes, that is also possible.
If I had to pin you down, and in your opinion, knowing that the body was actually discovered at 11 o'clock, would you say Mrs. Frasch died before or after 8 a.m.?
I would say that the greatest probability is that she died after 8 a.m.
Nothing further.
Cross.
Good morning again.
Morning, sir.
So you agree with Dr. Flanagan that drowning was likely the cause of death, correct?
Yes, sir.
You also agree with Dr. Flanagan that the head trauma likely could have rendered Mrs. Frasch unconscious.
Yes, sir.
So that would have rendered her unable to, I guess, get herself out of the pool if she were put in the pool, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you also agree with Dr. Flanagan that the swelling to the right side of the face likely occurred first. The injury, the trauma to the right side of the head occurred first, right?
I don't remember if that was her opinion, but I agree with what you've said, yes.
Okay. So trauma to the right side occurs first, and we get some swelling there, correct?
That's right.
Then you agree that the fracture to the left side occurs second.
Yes, sir.
And you stated that that likely would have come from falling, say, to a pool deck.
Correct.
And you also agree that the injuries to the right side of the face are consistent with maybe a punch.
Among other possibilities, that's true, yes.
Okay. Now, you said you agreed with Dr. Flanagan that it's unlikely that a golf club could have caused the injuries to the right side of the face, correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you, I guess, 100% exclude a golf club?
I cannot 100% exclude anything. It's not the standard of an opinion. There is no 100% certainty in medicine or in life.
Sure.
There is nothing about the injuries to the right side of her face that remotely suggests it was caused by a golf club. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely and inconsistent, but I won't go with 100% certainty on anything.
Certainly. But you agree with Dr. Flanagan's assessment?
Yes, sir.
Now, you also agree that the injuries likely occurred close in time to one another, correct?
Which injuries?
The injuries to the right side of the face and the fracture to the left.
Yes, when you refer to the fracture of the left, I prefer if we pull all of those injuries together. She had an impact site and a fracture and some internal brain injuries, all of which I believe occurred from the same impact from falling down. But yes, in terms of the injuries on the right side of her face and the injuries that arise from the impact to the left side, I think they are likely to have occurred relatively close proximity, but not at the same time.
Okay. Now, you talked about the trauma to the throat. You mentioned that you didn't think it was from being strangled, correct?
Correct.
But could it have occurred from being grabbed by the throat?
That's possible.
Would you always observe, I think you called it petechiae, if someone was maybe grabbed forcefully by the throat, would you necessarily always or usually see petechiae necessarily just because of that?
No, it would depend upon how forceful the grabbing was and what time period it was applied over. So always, no.
Okay, so could you have hemorrhaging from being grabbed forcibly and not see, I guess, some of those factors you talked about with strangulation, like petechiae?
Yes, sir, that's true.
So that throat trauma could also perhaps come from being grabbed forcibly?
It could.
Now, you talked about some factors that I guess you and other forensic pathologists use in approximating a time of death, because it's, as you said, not an exact pinpoint science, correct?
Yes, sir.
And one of those factors is rigor mortis,
Yes, sir.
which I guess is a chemical function in the body.
Yes, the muscles have energy stored up chemically. When you die, the control systems stop working, the muscles just start using up the energy and getting stiff.
Okay. And heat speeds that process up, right?
Yes, sir.
So the opposite of that would be cold temperatures slows that process down.
Yes, sir.
And you'd agree that you typically, in most cases, see rigor mortis set in a noticeable way in about 2 to 3 hours?
That's very common. Yes, sir.
Okay, so in our example here, I guess since we're in a cold pool, you'd expect that rigor mortis factor to sort of expand, to slow down, right? For it to be noticeable, it'd have to take 3, maybe 4 hours, right?
It's hard to say when it would become noticeable. I agree with you, it would slow down the process. That's definitely true. Whether it wouldn't become noticeable at all until 3 or 4 hours is hard to say. In fact, I can't say with certainty. But yes, it slows down the process.
Okay. And you'd agree in this case, we had EMS workers jumping into a pool trying to save Mrs. Frasch's life, right?
Well, we had firefighter jumping into the pool, and then we had EMS workers on the pool deck trying to save her life.
So we have people jumping in trying to save her life, correct?
One person in the pool, yes.
Okay. So I guess maybe they're not, noticing, is there any difficulty getting her out of the pool maybe as closely as maybe, a forensic pathologist might be, correct?
Sure,
It's probably a very rushed process, correct?
I would imagine.
And of course, from a perfect lab example, rigor mortis is going to be slower because of the temperature, correct?
Yes, sir.
So I guess compared to the perfect lab example, we're expanding our time frame for what we would expect normal rigor mortis to be.
For the rigor mortis, yes.
So is it fair to say that it's kind of a wash in your, I guess, analysis for the rigor mortis because we have a slower process, so you can't really, in trying to, I guess, in our 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. time frame, you can't really consider that since it's slower than what the time frame is.
You said 8 a.m. to 11 p.m.
Or 11 a.m., excuse me.
Okay. Well, you've expressed it in several ways in the question, and I can agree with one and not agree with the other.
I think it's an ambiguous question.
I'll rephrase.
Ask another question, please.
So you're saying 2 to 3 hours in a perfect lab example, room temperature, right? That's the time frame you would expect rigor mortis to be, I guess, noticeable.
Well, first of all, we don't have lab examples. We have real-life examples with investigating deaths. Second of all, rigor mortis may become evident at its earliest phase as little as an hour. 2 to 3 hours is when it's usually become more noticeable to most people, but yes, in the ordinary examples, which unfortunately this case is not, within 2 to 3 hours, most people have some noticeable rigor mortis.
And you agree that this would be slower because of the pool temperature?
Yes, sir.
And your understanding of the pool temperature was somewhere around 54 degrees Fahrenheit?
Something like that, yes.
So pretty cold?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Does movement of a body affect rigor mortis and how it sets in?
It may. It doesn't always, but it may.
Can, I guess, it cause rigor mortis to dissipate maybe from certain limbs if they've been moved around?
If you have rigor mortis developed in an area and you then stretch that muscle, you do what we call, you're breaking the rigor mortis in that muscle. And so whatever percentage of the rigor mortis was already developed, you have now dissipated. That muscle is capable of continuing to develop rigor mortis if there's still chemical energy stored in it, but the portion that you broke is gone forever. So if there is manipulation, there is a chance of breaking rigor mortis if you manipulate it the right way and if it's present.
Okay. So I guess back to our example of a firefighter jumping into the pool, I guess could disturbing that body also disturb rigor mortis?
Again, it could. It depends upon how much rigor mortis you have as far as what's likely to happen. If you have somebody with very little rigor mortis, moving the body could easily break that rigor mortis. If you have somebody who's in very well-developed stiff rigor mortis, I hate to be, gross here, but, we do see bodies that are so-called stiff as a board. You could have a person in rigor mortis, you could lift out of that pool and not break any of the rigor mortis. So is there a possibility that some of the manipulation broke some very, very slight rigor mortis which wasn't otherwise noticeable? That's possible. If someone were in very strong rigor mortis, would all of it just go away from moving the body out of the pool? No.
Well, I guess to get back to the example, we're talking about a process that's already been slowed down by the cold pool, correct?
Yes.
So we're likely in the early noticeable stages given the cold temperature, correct?
If at all. That's
Okay.
the problem.
So
The
we're
early
pro-
stages, if any at all.
Okay, so any rigor mortis may be broken if that body's disturbed, correct?
Again, theoretically, yes. We're talking about, and I'm looking at the totality of the evidence, all the other factors too.
We'll get to those, doctor.
But we're clearly looking at the very early postmortem period, including just focusing on the rigor mortis. So if there were rigor mortis present, it likely was very slight and might not have been noticeable and might have been easily broken.
Okay, so based on just looking at the rigor mortis, you'd agree that Mrs. Frasch could have easily have been in the pool 3 to 4 hours, correct?
If we only look at the rigor mortis, yes.
Would you agree that there's lots of literature and scientific study about rigor mortis?
I guess, I'm not sure what that means, lots of.
Well, I guess in the study of forensic pathology, there's lots of noted treatises and literature about rigor mortis, correct? It's talked about quite frequently.
It is talked about in the textbooks quite frequently. There is work on it, yes.
Okay. It's a really good factor in estimating how long someone has, I guess, been dead, correct?
It's one of the relevant factors. It is sometimes a really good factor and sometimes it's a very squishy factor. Depends upon the details of the case.
Now, body temperature. You talked pretty extensively about this on direct, but you'd agree that it's kind of not a factor here, right?
No, I wouldn't agree it's kind of not a factor. I would agree that it is something that we cannot deal with great precision. I think it's one of many factors that goes into a consistent picture in my mind as the basis of my opinion, but I don't think I would agree with your blanket statement.
Okay, well, in order to make a determination in science, you need data, right?
That's typically the case.
Well, in this case, as to body temperature, you don't have any data, do you?
That's not correct.
Well, what was the temperature of the body?
We don't know the exact temperature of the body. That's not the equivalent of having no data.
Well, I guess if you need to, I guess, to make any sort of calculation about body temperature, you need somewhere to start, correct?
I don't understand your question.
You need a reading of Mrs. Frasch's body to make any sort of, I guess, determination about how far she's gone from 98.6, which is a living person, correct?
We have one attempt to measure her body temperature. The thermometer did not register. My understanding is that those thermometers do not register below about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. We have some indication of the range of her body temperature. We absolutely do not have a precise measurement of it.
I guess what was the range of her body temperature then?
Somewhere around 80 or below.
But okay, maybe I'm not understanding. The thermometer doesn't register at below 80 degrees. That's your understanding?
Yes, sir.
So if the thermometer doesn't read below 80 degrees, did they get a reading or did they not?
They did not get a reading.
So I guess you don't have any data then, correct?
Incorrect. We have data that the body temperature was not high enough to register on that thermometer. That puts you at about 80 or below.
Okay, can you
I don't have an exact measurement. I said that already, but I do have data.
Okay, well, let's say, can you say the body was 60 degrees Fahrenheit?
I just said I do not have an exact measurement.
Can you say if the body is 70 degrees Fahrenheit?
I just said I do not have an exact measurement.
So you do not know what the temperature of Mrs. Frasch's body is, correct?
I do not have an exact measurement of her body temperature. I know that it was about 80 or below.
Well, you can't say about 80 because you don't know what it was, can you?
Yes, I can.
Can you say whether it was 40 degrees Fahrenheit?
I don't think you're understanding. The nature of the thermometers is such that they only read down to a certain point, and then below that you get a non-reading. So it's below that. That's what I know.
Well, you'd agree there's a big difference between 50 degrees and 80 degrees, right?
Yes, sir?
It's the difference between shorts and, a jacket and jeans, correct?
I'm not sure I'm getting the analogy.
Well, 30 degrees difference in Fahrenheit is a big difference in temperature, is it not?
Yes.
So I guess when you're saying you have information about 80 degrees, that's not accurate, is it?
It's not what I said. You've mischaracterized my testimony. I said about 80 or below. That is accurate.
Let's move on to livor mortis. You agree that it's not a very precise means of determining the time of death, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, did you view any photos of Mrs. Frasch on the scene with, I guess, the firefighters and EMS?
I do not recall seeing photos of her on the scene.
So you don't know what she looked like to determine whether or not how developed livor mortis was, do you?
I don't know based on personally observing photographs. I have information from the emergency medical records, but no, I don't have a personal observation.
Okay. And you'd agree you're trained to look for livor mortis, correct?
Yes, sir?
And the firefighters and EMS workers, they're trying to save her life, correct?
Correct.
So you agree they're in a rush, correct?
I think it's an urgent situation and they're probably rushing, yes.
So they may not be looking very closely to see where the blood has settled in her body, correct?
They may not. I have had many experiences of seeing lividity mentioned in emergency medical reports, so I know that frequently they are capable of seeing that, but it is not their focus at the time. That's absolutely correct.
Okay. Now, you didn't see any photos of her in the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
So you don't know what she looked like in the ambulance either?
Not based on any personal observations, correct.
Okay. Now, pigmentation can also affect one's, I guess, ability to ascertain lividity, correct?
Yes, sir?
And that could be another factor that might play into why a firefighter or an EMS worker might not notice livor mortis, correct?
Again, in the realm of all possibilities, yes.
Also, some things that can affect lividity is the body's orientation, correct?
In terms of positioning?
Yes.
Yes, the orientation or positioning definitely affects lividity because lividity is a process that happens with gravity, so depending upon what position you're in, depends upon where the lividity will settle.
So I guess in the 3 to 4 hour range, I guess, has lividity full on, I think the term is blanched?
I don't understand your question.
Well, we mentioned when we talked previously that at some point lividity becomes fixed, correct? The blood will not move no matter if you move the body or not, correct?
Correct.
Is that blanching or am I mispronouncing it?
It's the wrong term. You're not mispronouncing it. It's the wrong term.
Okay. What would you call it when it's fixed?
When lividity is formed by the blood settling in the blood vessels. At some point post-mortem, and it's very variable, but people usually talk in terms of many hours, some say 8, some say 12, but a number of hours after it has settled in place, the blood will frequently congeal. It's a post-mortem process, it's not true blood clotting, but if the blood congeals in the blood vessels, then it is no longer liquid, and it will not shift if you turn the body over. So that's called fixed lividity. It stays in place even if you move the body. I think, I wasn't trying to be obtuse with you, sir, but I think the blanching issue is if you have fixed lividity on the skin surface, so you have an area that's abnormally pink or red or purple, and you push into it, if the lividity is, excuse me, if the lividity is unfixed, then you will get blanching because the blood that's making the discoloration is still liquid. So if you put pressure on, you can force the blood out of those little blood vessels and you get a pale area. That's the blanching. If you have fixed lividity, it will not blanch when you press on it.
Okay. So I guess in early on livor mortis, moving the body will change where the blood settles?
Yes, sir.
I guess how long does it take for, I guess just giving me a range, how long does it take for fixed lividity to set in?
It's very variable. It takes at least hours generally. You'll see in the literature, you'll see at least 4 to 6 hours in some places 8 hours, some places 12 hours. In my experience, it is not only very variable, but lividity that fixes doesn't always completely fix. So, but it's to try to answer your question, how long does it take to fix lividity? It's a process that usually takes at least hours.
And I guess when you're saying at least hours, you're giving us a range from 4 to 6, but also up to 8 and 12?
Yes, sir.
So it's a very variable and hard to pinpoint range.
Correct.
So I guess when you're using lividity, it's hard to pinpoint when that would be fixed because it's different and it's variable.
Yes, sir.
Is there a lot of study on lividity in the medical literature?
Again, I don't know how to characterize a lot in the medical literature. It's certainly something that has been studied and written about. I mean, it's in the common textbooks. It's in the forensic literature.
And I guess what I'm getting across is this is something that's written about pretty extensively, like rigor mortis as a phenomenon that comes post-mortem.
Again, I'm not sure about the implication of extensively. It's in most of the textbooks. It's in various papers. It's something that is commonly considered and written about.
Now, did you also review Dr. Flanagan's or the toxicology report in this case?
Yes, sir.
And I guess how long after the consumption of alcohol would you expect it to be in the urine or the vitreous fluid?
Well, that really depends upon how much you had and what your blood concentration was. And the urine is a lot more difficult to try to answer the question about how long, because the alcohol in the urine has been excreted, and then it also depends upon how long the urine stays in the bladder. So that's not very good for timing things. The blood in the vitreous humor, which is the fluid in the eyes, the alcohol in the vitreous humor, which is the fluid in the eyes, tends to follow, it tracks the blood alcohol concentration with a lag time of about a half an hour or so. But depending upon where your blood alcohol concentration is, how high it is, that will then depend, or that will control how long alcohol will stay in your blood as you are metabolizing it away.
Okay. Well, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say someone's consumed 2 bottles of champagne from the hours of 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. Would you expect there to be some trace of that alcohol by, say, 11 a.m.?
I'm not going to be able to do very good calculations off the top of my head. Best I can tell you is, yes, it is possible that there would still be alcohol. I can't tell you more likely than not. It's a possibility.
Well, you say you can't do the calculations right now, and I certainly understand I put you on the spot, but you prepared for this case, right?
Yes, and I prepared specifically for what we covered in direct exam.
Okay, well, you reviewed the grand jury testimony, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you're aware that, Mr. Frasch brought up the issue that his wife had been up all night drinking heavily, 2 bottles of champagne, correct?
I remember that.
And you're also aware of the toxicology report because you reviewed it, that there was no alcohol found in her system.
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, you had these facts and you didn't think it was important to look into that?
It has nothing to do with whether I thought it was important to look into. I've simply referred to the issues that I was asked to consider for testimonial purposes.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but let's talk about pruning. Is this a typical thing medical examiners look at to determine time of death?
No, I don't think it's a typical thing that we look at for determining time of death. It is a factor that we universally look at in bodies recovered from water. It's a factor that does have some literature behind it as to its timing of occurrence, but no, it is not commonly used as an indicator of time of death.
So it's not commonly used, so not commonly by medical examiners, correct?
Right. It is usually not a factor in trying to determine time of death in a body recovered from water, because most of the time those bodies have been in the water long enough to develop the wrinkling, and once it develops, then it's no longer a factor or an issue. In the circumstance where I'm concerned about all the totality of the evidence indicating the early postmortem interval or time period, and in a circumstance where there is no wrinkling, then I think it becomes a significant factor that's valid to consider. But under most of the routine circumstances of bodies recovered from water, the time period is long enough that it no longer becomes an issue or a factor.
So to be clear, the literature you're talking about, is that from DeMaio, I think, is the literature you're talking about where you cited a study?
The DeMaio textbook does discuss it and cites to a prior study about it. I've seen it also in at least one other textbook, and I've looked through some of the literature that it's really old literature about looking at the wrinkling of fingers in living people. But the DeMaio textbook actually, I think, is a good one to indicate kind of the sense of knowledge in the literature.
And that DeMaio textbook, it cites to a study from Germany, correct?
It's a study that's in German. I don't remember where it came from, but it's a German publication.
Okay, so it's a German publication, and that study that was conducted was back in 1984, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that's a pretty old study, correct?
Depends upon what you mean by old study. There are some studies that are, a year or two old that are old because we've surpassed that body of knowledge. There are some studies that go back into the early part of the 20th century that I have in my collection that are still occasionally useful. So it's an old study, but its validity is applicable. I mean, whatever science there is of wrinkling the fingers hasn't changed since 1984.
Well, you'd agree that this isn't commonly used amongst medical examiners, correct, pruning?
It is commonly a consideration of medical examiners every time you have a body that's been immersed. It is not commonly a factor that is useful for determining or estimating time of death for the reasons I said before, that usually the body's already been immersed long enough that there is the wrinkling, and at that point you can't really use it for timing. It's just like the analogy here in this case is the lividity. Lividity is not a great way of determining time of death, but the onset or lack of onset of lividity in the very early postmortem period is a very important factor as far as trying to estimate time of death in a circumstance such as this.
Now, I guess, can you say with any exact precision how fast any given individual will prune in water?
No, of course not. That's not a possibility in medicine ever. I can't tell you exactly how fast any one given person will do one thing or respond to something. I can tell you what is the body of knowledge of human beings and what's the typical or average timing or range, but no, I can't tell you exactly what happens with one person under one circumstance.
Now, you're basing the lack of pruning also upon the EMS firefighters, correct? Reporting that they didn't observe any pruning?
Yes, sir.
Okay. They also didn't notice any facial swelling either, did they?
I believe that's correct.
Okay, so they didn't notice facial swelling, which is pretty significant on the right side of her face, correct?
It's noticeable.
So, I mean, pruning would be far less noticeable than, say, swelling on all over what you'd agree is the right side of her face, correct?
Not all of the right side of her face. The bruised areas around the right eye socket are swollen.
You'd agree it was pretty significant swelling, wouldn't you?
I'd agree it's noticeable.
And they didn't notice that either, did they?
They apparently didn't record that. That's correct.
Now, your ultimate conclusion about Mrs. Frasch's time in the pool, if I heard correctly, was 1 to 2 hours, correct? You would say?
Most probably within 1 to 2 hours, yes.
But not 3 hours?
I didn't say not 3 hours. I said most probably 1 to 2 hours. I did not exclude categorically any period that's longer than that. I think given the totality of the factors, especially the very, very early lividity developing in the emergency department, the absence of rigor mortis, the absence of the pruning, I think we're in the very early postmortem period, and that places us into the range of about 1 to 2 hours. It could be longer. It's possible that it could be longer, but that's less probable.
So you cannot exclude 3 hours, 4 hours, can you?
Categorically exclude with absolute certainty? You're correct, sir, I cannot.
And your conclusion is based mostly on lividity and pruning, correct?
It's based on the totality of the evidence. It's based on the lividity, or essentially lack thereof. It's based on the lack of the pruning. It is also based on the lack of any identified or identifiable rigor mortis. I think that's still a significant factor. And the temperature is a lesser factor, but it's in there.
Okay. Temperature we've talked about. And the rigor mortis, also we agree that that would be slowed down easily within the 3 to 4 hour range, correct?
It will be slowed down, yes.
So that's really not as big a factor as what you're considering for your conclusion as lividity and pruning, correct?
It may not be as big a factor. To me, it's still a significant factor.
Now, you're not here doing charity work, are you?
No, sir. Neither are you.
Correct. You're being paid for your consulting here today, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
You're being paid $450 an hour, aren't you?
My consulting work is at $450 an hour.
Okay. How many hours did you bill in the preparation for this case?
I believe it's been 19 over the course of a year or whatever I've been involved in the case.
19. So that's somewhere around $8,000?
I'm not good at math off the top of my head, but I think you're in the ballpark.
Okay. And in addition to that, just for appearing here today, you're paid an additional $4,000, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
And in addition to that, they paid for your travel and your lodging, didn't they? And by they, I mean the defense.
Yes, sir. They cover the expenses.
And your conclusion is 1 to 2 hours, but not likely 3, correct?
Highly probable within 1 to 2 hours. Not impossible, but much less likely to be 3 hours or longer.
And you're going to be compensated somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000, aren't you?
Roughly, yes, sir.
No further questions.
Be ready.
Dr. Arden, you were just asked about your compensation. You don't work for free.
Correct.
Do you only work for persons like Dr. Frasch that are accused of crimes?
No, actually about half of my consulting work is in civil matters where one party is suing another. The other half is in criminal matters such as this. In criminal matters, most of my cases I'm retained by the criminal defense because the prosecution has the local medical examiner to use as their expert. I am occasionally consulted by prosecutors as an outside expert. I am occasionally put on the witness stand by them, but there just isn't much of that business to be had.
So when you are hired by a prosecutor, are you paid for your time?
Yes, sir.
And you have, so in fact, been hired by prosecutors in various states and been compensated for your time?
Yes, sir.
Now, you were asked a lot about data, and to try to clarify what you meant by you do have data. Did you have any data that suggested that Mrs. Frosch's body temperature was 98.6 degrees when she was discovered?
No, sir.
How about 95 degrees?
No, sir.
How about 90?
No, sir.
85?
No, sir.
81?
No, sir.
Less than 80?
Yes, sir.
So is that what you mean by you did have data, you knew what her body temperature was not?
I knew what range it was not, and I knew in a broad sense what range it was.
And that was based upon the reports by both the paramedics, the firefighters, and also the lack of a reading on this thermometer. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You admitted that you weren't on the scene to observe a lot of these factors that weighed into your ultimate conclusion, correct?
Yes, sir.
To your knowledge, was Dr. Flanagan at the scene to observe any of these?
She was not.
She was just there in the autopsy room,
Correct.
which is what you would typically expect from a medical examiner.
Very commonly.
ask some questions about intoxication. Were you tasked with trying to figure out whether the intoxication data was accurate or not?
No, sir.
Did you rely on that data in reaching your conclusion?
No, sir.
Did you, when ultimately rendering your opinion, did you consider all of the factors, all of your training, all of your education, all of the texts that are out there, and your experience in ultimately reaching your conclusions?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, any juror have a question of this witness? We'll go sidebar. Couple of inquiries from the jury. Where would you expect to find pruning?
The wrinkling or pruning most typically occurs in the fingers and toes, especially the tips of those, but it's the skin of the surfaces of the fingers and toes.
What about the arch of the foot?
I don't think it's impossible to have some of this wrinkling in other places, but much less likely to be on the arch of the foot.
Does the presence of alcohol impact the post-death processes that you've been referring to?
No, actually, if there were alcohol in her system, I would not expect it, to affect any of the processes that I discussed previously.
Will drying and warming a body during resuscitation dissipate wrinkling or pruning?
In my experience, bodies that are recovered from water that are removed and then brought to the medical examiner's office.
Here's the question, doctor. Will drying and warming a body during resuscitation, assuming that to be a fact, would that dissipate wrinkling or pruning? Please answer that question, sir.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. In my opinion, no.
Okay. Any follow-up, Mr. Taylor?
Your Honor.
Ms. Kappelman?
No, Your Honor.
Or, I'm sorry, Mr. Mood. All right, you may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I want to take one of the attorneys. Let's take 5 minutes. We'll let the jury. It's going to be a little longer than 5 minutes. All right, we'll take a short break. Be seated, please. Are you going to have further testimony, Mr. Taylor?
I'm sorry?
Are you going to have further testimony?
No, Your Honor, we're going to announce rest.
All right, so your client has decided not to testify?
That is correct.
All right. As I indicated, I would like to colloquy him on that issue if you warned him of that.
Yes, sir.
All right, if you stand up, please. Mr. Frasch, place him under oath, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
State your name, please, sir.
Adam Michael Frasch.
And are you currently under the influence of any alcohol, drug, or medication?
No, sir.
Are you take a prescribed medication?
Yeah, oh, yes. Yes,
What prescribed medication are you currently taking?
sir. G1.
You taking anything other? You taking anything other? You taking anything other? You taking anything other?